Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast. Ozcast. Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Hello and welcome back to The Focus. 3 weeks after President Trump's inauguration, and the state of both America and the world have been disrupted. The American people, jaded by the old way of doing things, voted for disruption, and disruption is what the American people got. However, those who did not have a stake in the US election, that is, the people of the international community, are having to adjust their expectations quite radically. Trump's Gaza plan, US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth's address to NATO, J.D. Vance's address to the Munich Security Conference, and Trump's proposed outreach to Putin on Ukraine illustrates growing disquiet at new realities. Are we facing a revolutionary moment in how America approaches the world, or are these all negotiating points for Trump's out-of-the-deal approach to everything? Join us as we speak with returning guest Roy Casagranda, coming to us from Dubai, as we look at where Trump 47 is taking us. Roy, Happy New Year and welcome back to The Focus.
Thank you so much.
Now, Roy, we'll start off with Pete Hegseth, shall we? His address to the NATO Ukraine contact group. What did you make of his address, and what does this bode for Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and his country?
Yeah, so I mean, the first thing I think Zelensky should do is invest in diapers, because if I was him, I would be peeing myself.
Yeah.
Every time the Trump administration, in 45 and now 47 says anything anti-NATO, I think everybody in Eastern Europe needs to be really worried. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Moldova, like, it doesn't matter whether you're a NATO state or not a NATO state, you need to be frightened. Just the fact that Pete Hegseth has said he's going to cut the size of the US military down, and has indicated that there needs to be serious concessions on the side of Ukraine. So I wouldn't be surprised if the deal that the Trump administration pushes on Ukraine would be to give up the 5 provinces that the Russians have annexed. It would be devastating for Ukraine in the sense that a lot of that is industrial zone. So it would be really rough for the Ukrainian state from a industrial capacity perspective to recover from that. It also means cutting off most of the Ukraine's coast. So it also would not quite make Ukraine inland state. It'd still have Odessa, but it would be pretty devastating for the Ukraine from a trade perspective, from a defense perspective as well, because it would also technically put the Russians on the other side of the Dnieper, if they gave all of the Kherson province, right? As things currently stand, the Russians are not on the west side of the Dnieper, but they've annexed the west side of the Kherson province. So in any case, I think this bodes ill for Zelensky, and I don't see why Trump would care about Zelensky or Ukraine. He's a transactional person. What's he going to get out of a transaction with Zelensky compared to what he's going to get out of a transaction with Putin? So I think that all of NATO should be concerned, and definitely Ukraine should be as well.
Well, Roy, there'd be some people saying that, Ukraine has now promised some $500 billion of rare earths to the United States in the hope that maybe the United States will continue pumping military assistance into Ukraine. Do you think that that was a serious discussion, or do you think it was just fluff?
Well, I mean, I'm sure that Zelensky would do something like that, because at this point I would be doing everything I could if I was Zelensky. So I don't think it's a bluff on Zelensky's part. I think the question is it enough to is it enough to counteract whatever Putin's going to offer Trump in return, right?
mm,
Um,
mm, mm, mm,
I think the shocking or the alarming thing about the Trump administration from a foreign policy standpoint, so it doesn't matter what state you are on the planet, he has no loyalty to anybody, not to Canada, not to
yeah.
Mexico, not to the Federal Republic of Germany. The only thing he cares about is the deal,
Mm,
and he may not understand the deal, so it's his assumption about what the deal is.
mhm.
And so you're stuck trying to get into his mind and then try to figure out what he thinks the equation is, and then he'll pick the heavier side of the equation time after time. For whatever reason, he's madly in love with these uh, heavy-handed authoritarian types like Putin
Mm.
or Kim Jong Un, and so as a result, I think his default setting will always be to lean toward those guys. So if I were Zelensky, I would be putting everything on the table that I had.
Mm.
It's just I don't know that it'd be enough.
I heard that a subgroup, a European security subgroup called the Nordic Baltic Eight, stated their continuing support for Ukraine. But without the United States, does this really amount to anything significant? And also, what danger then does this have for those countries in the Nordic Baltic Eight? Obviously, they're a subgroup within the broader NATO. They're also very close to Russia. There's been some talk that perhaps Putin's next target may be a NATO state. What do you say about that?
Yeah, I mean, I know that's definitely the dialogue that's going on in the Baltic states. Latvia and Lithuania, especially, but even Estonia, are very nervous, and they were very worried that the Trump administration, that a second Trump administration would be the end of their ability to be defended. I mean, it's worth pointing out that one of the reasons why there's the Nordic Baltic Eight and that they're all NATO states is Finland and Sweden literally just joined. They
Yeah.
joined during the Biden administration because Finland realized that not being in NATO was pretty catastrophic. Um, Finland and Sweden have a deal where they're the Boxy twins of Europe. Anything one does, the other one does. And and so Finland went to Sweden and said, we have to join NATO, but we won't join without you. And Sweden said, we've been neutral for, not quite 2 centuries, but pushing really close to 2 centuries. And we're willing to give up our neutrality because we have to protect you. And it was like this really painful moment for Sweden's identity as a neutral state. And they applied and they joined. So I think there is a sense that uh, a sense of fear in Eastern Europe that Russia is going to, try to reassert this a Soviet Union style or even a Russian Empire style, depending on which direction Putin decides he wants to go, empire that gobbles up a bunch of Eastern European states. And the fear is well founded. Look what happened to Georgia in 2008. Look at what's happening in Ukraine. The problem, of course, with the United States is that the United States has been the bulwark against Russian expansion westward. And you have to remember that Russian expansion westward, and for that matter, eastward, is a centuries long project. Um, where St. Petersburg today, that used to be Scandinavia, that was Ingermanland. And, there's been this kind of push west. Finland was, during the Napoleonic Wars, annexed by the Russians when the Russians were allied with Napoleon, because Sweden, which owned Finland at the time, was allied with the UK, right? And so it was a moment of punishment for Sweden's mistake in being on the wrong side. And so there's always been this kind of westward push, with the glory being post World War II, the Iron Curtain, and the Eastern European satellite states. Post World War II, Poland was shoved westward, and a big chunk of Eastern Poland was annexed into the Soviet Union. And so there's a history that Eastern Europe and Scandinavia have with the Russians that doesn't seem to be going away, and I get their fear. Having said that, there is a little flicker of hope. Um, I think it was late 2022. The German parliament decided that the United States was no longer a reliable ally. That at some point down the road, the United States was either just going to outright abandon NATO or at least be a weak NATO member. So Germany decided to remilitarize. And their goal is to have the third largest military on the planet. It'll be larger than the Russian military if they achieve their goal. In other words, Germany's back, and their goal is to protect Europe without having to rely on the United States. Because of that, I think there's a chance that Russia can kind of be offset because a another Russian German war might not prove very effective for the Russians this time around. If especially if the United States isn't attacking from the other side, especially if the UK isn't an enemy of Germany. And so just the threat that there's a new German military presence in Europe might be enough to offset an attack on a NATO state. But I think the NATO has written the United States off as the threat to Russia.
It's interesting that you raise this whole notion of Germany. Germany's got a number of problems, both economic but predominantly demographic, which is also driving the economic problem for Germany. Do you think really that with the German population not expanding outwards in any significant degree, as a matter of fact contracting, there'll be enough young Germans who will be able to wear the uniform and pose the kind of counterweight to Russian military aggression that you suggest they're wanting to do? Is there not a practical limit to what Germany today could achieve? Because we're not talking about Germany in 1939, we're talking about Germany in 2025. It's a very different beast.
Yeah, you're totally right. It is a very different beast, in part because German culture has changed so much, right? The whole idea of the Prussian war machine is in the past. So Germany is going to have to create a new war culture after decades of intentionally avoiding Prussian war culture. Um, so that's on the table. The fact that Germany's economy has kind of been stagnant for 5 years and hasn't really been growing, that's on the table. You're totally right about the demographics. Um, I think the joke today is if you really want to genocide a population, educate them and give them lots of wealth. They'll stop making babies and they'll just sort of take themselves off the table.
Yeah.
Um, so Germany, ironically enough, to fix that demographic problem, has a really good solution. It's the I word, immigration. If Germany would just simply let people immigrate to Germany on a, it's going to have to be a significant scale. It doesn't have to be a dramatic scale, but definitely significant. They could start to offset this negative population growth. Um, if you did it right, you did it like Sweden, where you're trying to integrate the second generation immigrants. You give up on the first generation, you focus on the second generation immigrants. You can have considerable stability. There's no reason to think that immigrants are going to come in and be a disruptive force. But the problem, of course, is the AfD, the AfD, is growing in popularity because of German anti-immigrant sentiment to the point where Merz, the fool that he is, just gave the AfD this big win by playing this really dangerous game by counting on their votes and trying to get this anti-immigration bill passed. Ironically enough, it didn't pass because the AfD saw that this was a great opportunity to undermine the CDU and improve their chances of a win in the next election. So, just the fact that we're in that situation makes me really nervous about Germany.
Yeah, yeah.
A year ago or 2 years ago, my hope was in Germany, and now I'm thinking I'm a little bit less hopeful.
Some of my colleagues on my LinkedIn network were suggesting, well, if all else falls over, the Brits peel off because of Brexit and various complexities within the British polity, then there's always good old France. France can step into the breach. But of course, France has got its own problems, and it's got the National Front with Marine Le Pen. They're making huge inroads, just as the AfD is doing in Germany. So, in that sense, where is the center of gravity in today's Europe? I mean, there was a time when you could point to France as being a counterbalance or a sober voice in the room. I don't believe that we can really rely on that anymore. I don't think that that's the case. Germany is struggling to try to get itself across the line to become a normalized power in Europe after years of basically self-flagellation for World War II,
Yeah.
which is justified up to a point. But then, I mean, even if you've got Israeli strategists and members of the Israeli Knesset saying, all right, enough already. It's time for you to step up. I mean, that's saying something, but the Germans are just ignoring everything and they just keep on going down this particular path, which then leads me to my neck of the woods, which is the Asia Pacific. I mean, we're starting to see some very interesting things coming from Japan, also a former Axis country, also a country, dare I say, burdened by the peace constitution that was enforced on them and their Article 9, I think. The fact of the matter is, Japan seems to be trying to whittle down as much of Article 9 as possible in order for it to become a much greater player in the Asia Pacific, which is obviously putting the Chinese, the Koreans, both North and South, Vietnam, and various other Southeast Asian players off because they remember World War II. They also remember their time under Japanese occupation. They didn't have a good time, and so therefore, are they going to be welcoming the Japanese now? I mean, time does change, and sometimes it heals wounds, but sometimes it really doesn't.
I mean, we're seeing that with the South Korea Japan relationship. It should be a much stronger relationship than it is today, and I think
Mm,
the primary reason that it's not is because South Korea is still bitter about what the Japanese did
yeah.
to the Koreas or to Korea because it wasn't Korea's yet.
Mm,
Um, and so yeah, Japan didn't do what Germany did. Germany spent a huge amount of time trying to, and you call it self-flagellation, but it was also you know apology after apology after apology and making amends
mm,
and doing things like forcing their children to everybody has to go on a field trip to a concentration or death camp.
yep.
Auschwitz is sort of the prize, but obviously they would go to other places like Dachau as well,
Mm,
just to sink in. We made a mistake. We're owning it. We're ready to move on to a degree, right? Because you're right, Germany is still guilt ridden and it still hasn't fully moved on. In the case of Japan, they did what the United States did, right? We're just going to whitewash our history, pretend nothing happened, and carry on,
yeah.
and try to avoid apologizing. There has been some apology done to China, but they really haven't made the kind of amends that they should have, and they're paying for it now because what should be happening right now is South Korea, Japan, the Philippines, Indonesia, Australia need to be creating an alliance group, and you're going to get hesitation from the Asian states because of what Japan did.
Mm,
Having said that, Japan has worked, you know, around its constitution a little bit. So Japan has never had a constitutional amendment, which since the United States gave it a constitution post
yeah.
World War II,
Yeah.
there was an attempt a few years ago to get it so that they no longer had to have a strictly defensive military. That attempt failed. The voters chose not to change the constitution. What Japan has done is reworded how it describes some of the equipment it's putting into its military.
Mm,
And so as a result, Japan now has two aircraft carriers. They're not officially aircraft carriers, they're officially destroyers. They have a flat surface. Planes land and take off from them. So if I call an aircraft carrier a destroyer, is it a destroyer? And they're named after two World War II aircraft carriers, and they're called a defensive thing. You don't if you're Japan, you don't need aircraft carriers for defense. Japan's already an aircraft carrier.
mm,
You if you're a maybe if you're India, you want aircraft carriers for defense. But in the case of Japan, they the only reason you would ever need an aircraft carrier is for offensive. You
mm,
want to take the fight to somebody else. So the reality is Japan is doing something similar to Germany, and it is also remilitarizing. There's been rumors for years that Japan has also got a nuclear weapons program, and that at some point they'll announce that they have the nuke because they probably do already. I don't know how
mm,
true any of that is, but it's
mm,
fascinating to me that we're in a situation where Japan feels the need to remilitarize and is at least considering the possibility of having a nuclear weapons arsenal. So one of the things that Trump has definitely done is he's upended the United States' policies at the end of World War II. And what the United States really wanted at the end of World War II was to make sure that Japan and Germany never remilitarized fully. That, obviously we had to modify that with West Germany because we needed them to remilitarize a little bit more than we had originally hoped. Um, during the Cold War, but the long-term goal was to keep Germany and Japan as satellite states of the United States, linked to the United States for all eternity, with small militaries, and then the United States would do the dirty work for Japan and Germany. So the United States would do the Korean War, the United States would do the Vietnam War, and in that way Japan could just stay safe. And so Trump has changed all of that in just really 8 years because he hasn't been able to serve this term yet. He's done what anybody who was a nationalist in Germany or Japan had hoped would happen. And he's put a wedge between our allies, which of course is the Russian post World War II dream.
Yeah, exactly. Well, okay. So we've spoken about Europe, we've spoken about Asia, but in your observation, what are the main or the key differences between how Asia and Europe are dealing with Trump? Because we've seen recently the Europeans are still suffering from, I don't know, post-traumatic stress disorder after they heard Hegseth and Vance. Um, and I don't know, the Asian side seems a bit quiet. You know, we tend to take for granted that the United States is going to shoulder in the burden on the defense of Taiwan when, you know, the reality is that there are huge question marks even over that now that Trump is there. But are the Asians playing the Trump card better than the Europeans, or are both of them kind of still trying to come to grips with it? Is there some sort of plan that you think that either one hemisphere or the other has to deal with the orange one?
From what I can tell, and like my knowledge is definitely not uh, omnipotent by any means, but from what I can tell, it looks to me like most Asian states and European states are floundering and they don't know what to do, which
Right.
is disappointing to me because you had a few years to prepare. Like the Biden administration is disappointing to me because they had one job, and that was to prevent Trump from being president.
Yeah.
And they had 4 years to make that happen, and they failed. And so, at some level, I feel like Europe and Asia have been acting a little too slow
Mm.
in maybe they just couldn't comprehend that Trump was going to get a second term. Maybe it was just like this can't possibly be true. One of the situations right now is with the Philippines. So
Yeah.
on one of the atolls, there's a wrecked World War II ship, and there are Filipinos on it. The World Court has ruled that that atoll belongs to the Philippines. All those atolls right there belong. The Chinese have possession of multiple of them. So China is simply ignoring the World Court's ruling. But the Chinese go to this one atoll that has the wrecked ship and they fire water cannons at the Filipinos in an attempt to knock them off the ship so that they can take possession of this atoll. The first question in my mind is why does China need any more land? Like, surely they have a big enough state. The second question is why isn't the US taking this seriously at some level and shoring up its alliance with the Philippines? Why isn't Japan doing a little bit more to help the Filipinos out in this situation? There seems to be sort of this let's ignore it and hope it goes away kind of malaise. The poor Filipinos are trying their best to hold on to the situation. And it almost feels like the kind of malaise of the 1930s,
Yeah.
where, Chamberlain was like, if we just ignore Germany, eventually it'll work its way out. And of course, from history tells us that's not how it works. You have to be a little bit more aggressive and you have to do a little bit more. So one of my hopes is actually Indonesia. They have a brand new president as well. He's been in office, I think, 4 months, and we have yet to see what's going to happen. But from what I've observed of Indonesia over the last few years, Indonesia seems to be generally going in the right direction. That uh, they could become a little bit of a local power. And if they
Yeah.
work with their neighbors, and I believe they have a little bit of cooperation going on. I know they have cooperation with Timor Leste and the Philippines and Malaysia on multiple issues. If that happens, coupled with Australia and Australia taking a little bit of a leadership role, I really think there could be some kind of resistance. The problem is none of that helps Taiwan.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know how anybody can stop China from taking Taiwan except the United States. So if the United States isn't in between in the Straits of Taiwan, in between the People's Republic and the Republic of China, I don't see how Taiwan makes it through the other side. So if I were Taiwanese, one of the things I would be doing right now is looking at how I can get some of my assets overseas to have a backup plan in case the PRC is a little too heavy-handed when they take over Taiwan.
You know, there have been a lot of people suggesting that the window on Taiwan is closing. Some scamps out in the strategic studies community putting forward the idea that 2027 might be the year, or anywhere between 2027 and 2030, which is really around the corner in geopolitical terms. Um,
Absolutely.
yeah, the thing is, when you've got something like this happening in the background, it really requires levels of trust in your allies in order for them to actually meet your expectations. And at the moment, from where I'm sitting, at least in Australia, President Trump has been breaking trust all over the place. And look, honestly, if ever there was an illustration of this having be taking place in real time, it's what's happening in Ukraine right now. So that's probably the only other analogous situation for Taiwan to study and think, oh my God, this could be us. And the Americans may not turn up, and all of a sudden, the Chinese have sovereignty over Taiwan, and maybe not even a shell will be fired. So this is a real concern here, and I'm not sure whether we have the political strength at local levels to deal with stuff like this. And again, from an Australian perspective, there is pressure being placed on us to do more. I mean, we're like the Europeans in many ways. We've got a hollowed out defence force. We're not spending enough on defence, and we're faced with a prospect of either American abandonment if we don't do enough, or we take the abandonment and we go full social democrat and just give welfare to everybody and hope for the best and that no one takes us over. So it's really not a happy situation for us.
It's not. And so, if I were Taiwan, actually, let's flip it. If I were Xi,
Mm.
or the People's Republic of China, uh, the lesson I would have learned from the Ukraine war is attack Taiwan during the Trump administration.
Yeah.
The big mistake for Putin was that he waited until Biden, and then Biden and NATO stepped in. If you do it while Trump is president, based on his past behavior, I don't think that anything will happen. You know, one of the things that happened in Trump 1.0 was that he would talk big and he would threaten, and then when people would call him on the threats, he would run away.
Mm.
And so there's this level of cowardice that, by the way, I totally approved of. Just to be clear, like when he killed General Soleimani in
Yeah.
Iraq,
Mm.
right? Iran said we
Iran.
are going to retaliate.
Oh.
They did. They injured something like 200 U.S. military personnel, and then Trump went, since they didn't retaliate, there's no reason for us to respond. And you're like, no, they did. They did retaliate. And I was totally happy that he didn't respond because the last thing I wanted to see was escalation to another war the United States will lose.
Mm.
So at some level, I approve of Trump's cowardice. The problem is, in this particular instance, it doesn't help Taiwan any. And to be clear, I don't like it when states are split. So the fact that Taiwan and People's Republic of China are separate doesn't just my default setting is, oh, this just feels like another North Korea, South Korea. This just feels like another East Germany, West Germany. And I think as a general rule, that's wrong. Having said that, I also believe people should be able to determine their future and their outcome. So if the Taiwanese people don't want to be annexed, the majority don't want to be annexed by China, I think the world should support Taiwan's decision. And I don't think it's black and white, it's gray for
Mm.
sure. It's just I'm leaning towards Taiwan because I believe that people should determine their outcomes. Having said that, I just don't see Trump caring about Australia. I don't see he cares about New Zealand or Canada or Mexico or Denmark or anybody. What person stands up and says, I'm going to do a 25% tariff on your country and I'm thinking about invading it when they're not only your largest and your second largest trading partners, they're your neighbors and your allies? Like, it doesn't even make sense. That's not art of the deal. That's not negotiation. That looks like extortion. That looks like what a mafia boss would do. And
Yeah.
the fact that some people think, oh, he's disrupting the system, but it's not it's not like he's bringing something new to the system. He's just acting like an old style tyrant, an old style bully, and it breaks trust. It makes
Mhm.
everybody realize the United States is not a reliable ally. He changes his position within the same sentence. He'll change his position. It's not even just day to day, and that incoherence he thinks creates the ability to negotiate better. But in reality, I just think he's disrupting the world system and making the world much more dangerous.
There are many Trump supporters or people who downplay the big man theory of international politics. They categorically state that American security relations around the world are as strong as ever, and what we are seeing play out in the media are theatrics and overblown leftist fear-mongering. What do you say to that, Roy? I had to put it to you.
I mean, I wish that was true because look, if we're honest, since World War II, the United States has been a bad actor. The wars the United States has conducted have not been for the benefit of humanity. The, as a we How many democracies have we overthrown? Like we post World War II, we overthrew the Syrian democracy, we overthrew Iran's democracy, we overthrew Guatemala's democracy, we overthrew Chile's. Like we just this is just a thing we've done. We have not been the good guy necessarily on the block. Having said that, the United States did do some good things, including creating a measure of stability. Like the prospect of World War III was always on the table, but because of mutual assured destruction, it was just a remote possibility. If it was going to happen, it was going to be because of an accident, as opposed to somebody decided one day, let's just do this. And and then you know the United States eventually did engagement with China and brought China into the global system, and that was obviously a good thing because the world would get more stability from having China integrated in. Now China has misbehaved on more than one occasion, of course. So it's not, again, it's not black and white. All of this stuff is extremely complicated, and if you this is one of those complexity issues where, like, the analogy I have is the asteroid belt. The planet almost formed in between Mars and Jupiter, and Jupiter decided one day that it was bored with its orbit and moved closer to the sun. And then, by the way, went back. So I don't know how planets can change their orbits, but apparently this is what it did. But when it did, the gravitational tides tore up the asteroid belt and prevented it from forming a planet. Now, the reason this matters is there's probably gold in the asteroid belt. So at some point, and other stuff as well, rare earth metals, you name it. So at some point, we're going to want to start mining this thing. The thing is there's how many? I don't even know how many objects. I'm assuming it's thousands of objects in this really interesting orbit around the sun. And you pull out one or two or three of these things, you probably won't change anything. But at some point, the gravities that they have are interacting with each other, and you'll pull out one too many of these things, destabilize the orbit, and some of them might come flying into the inner solar system and impact the Earth. And you just don't know how many there are because we have no computer system on the planet that can get past two bodies when trying to figure out how they interact with gravity, right? It's the three body problem. So if you have thousands of bodies, you're way past the three body problem. That's what politics is like. That's how international relations are. It's really complicated because there's so many actors. If it was just two actors, maybe you could set up a prediction model. And as a result, we need to be careful when we do things. And so, even though the United States, I have been a fierce critic of US foreign policy my entire career, even though the US makes lots of mistakes, I don't think flipping 180, obviously, it's not going to be 180 because suddenly the United States is going to be the good guy, but I don't think flipping 180 instantaneously is going to get you anywhere positive. It's just going to create a bunch of instability in a system that's too complicated to predict what that means. And I think that's the last thing the world needs. What we really need to be doing right now is working together and fighting global warming and trying to figure out what we can do as a planet to slow down global warming. Instead of worrying about Trump's agenda, there's only two genders, and I need to extract more wealth from the rest of the world. Those are not the things we need to be thinking about.
One of the things that I thought of while you were talking, and that is that, if you bring in China and the United States and Russia in some form of triumvirate, maybe the combined power of China and Russia would be able to constrain American hubris, if you will, and maybe some form of stability will come back to the international community. It won't be anything like the stability that we enjoyed post World War II, but it might be something. What are your thoughts on that?
I'm a fan of a multipolar world. When we had the Cold War, it did create a sort of stability. There was instability in the sense that if you were in Somalia or Ethiopia, there was going to be a proxy war, right? And there was instability if you were in Angola and Namibia and South Africa.
Mm,
So I'm not saying that it was globally stable, but for the most part, there was a little bit of stability. When the Soviet Union collapsed, all of a sudden the United States became the hegemonic superpower, and it had a fantastic opportunity to try and push the world in a positive direction, and it abdicated that and instead pursued its own interests and avoided real diplomacy and real problem solving and did absurd things, and here we are, right? So apparently having a hegemonic superpower is a bad idea, because that at least in the case of the United States, it destabilized the world at a time when we needed more stability. So I'm open to a multipolar system. The problem is, so Russia is too weak to be one of the poles.
mm,
Now it's trying to change that and become a superpower again, but it's not there yet. China obviously is really pushing hard against the United States, and so it's obvious that the United States and China are going to be in this equation. Putin's goal from the moment he became president was to avoid Russia becoming a satellite state of China. By attacking Ukraine, he put himself in a position where he was forced to accept Russia becoming a satellite state of China. So he screwed himself up that way. India has potential. I hope Europe can figure out how to be one of the poles. And I'm also hoping that the eastern part of Asia. So, and I'm basically, I know Australia is officially a continent, but in my mind, it's actually a really big island. So Australia
I take offense to
to
that, Roy.
Australia to Japan. Like, why isn't there that as a cooperative zone working not just economically but militarily to create more stability? If something like that happened, maybe some kind of Middle East thing, some kind of South America or Latin American thing, I could see that working. The problem is I don't see states moving in that direction. There isn't the kind of cooperation that we should be having right now. The dramatic rise of the right globally is alarming, and I feel like instead of it's making it so that we'll have this multipolar world, I think what it's doing is it's fracturing. Um, the constant anti-European Union sentiment that keeps bubbling up in the right in Europe is scary and dangerous. Brexit was, of course, catastrophic for the UK, but if you started to lose too many more states, I think it would ruin the European experiment. Brexit might have been necessary for the European experiment because the UK was never going to be it
Yeah.
was never going to accept full province.
Subjugation.
You know,
Yeah. Yeah, no, you're right. You're
um,
right.
but Scotland might break away from the UK and rejoin the EU, and that would be great. So at some level, I feel like at a time when we need to be really thinking about global warming and what happens to our children and our grandchildren, we're flying to the right and worrying about immigration and how many genders there are and these really unimportant, superfluous things that are driving fear and anger. And that to me feels like a formula for not just scapegoating internally, but scapegoating externally that leads to the types of conflicts that we saw in the 1930s. And my 1930s alarm bells are going off. I think 2025 is 1933 2.0, and I'm not happy about it.
Yeah, look, I can see the parallels as well. But again, when we're talking about people and their political predilections, at what point in a democratic setting do we say, que sera, sera? The people have voted, they've voted for Trump, they're going to probably vote for the AfD, they're going to probably vote for the National Front, they're going to be voting for all these right-wing parties because for so many years, centrist or left-wing parties have been kind of deaf to their own constituents. People have
It's
been
true.
worried about, their identities. They've been worried about modernity. They've been worried about immigrants coming and displacing them. They are seeing their livelihoods and their lifestyles eroding before their eyes, and they want that to end. So when the big person comes on the street, and sometimes it's a woman, sometimes it's a man, sometimes it's, you know, as you say, it's not really important, but still, it's an individual, of some strength and some character who then says, "Well, look, follow me. I'll lead you to I'll lead you to the solution." And in actual fact, they don't lead you anywhere except into a huge crap heap. So this is a lesson that obviously we as humans have yet to learn. We have to bash our heads against the wall with another frenetic round of violence, both internally within our states and externally. We have to go through the lack of trust before we can find trust all over again, because the trust was broken under the old regime. I mean, in that sense, I understand the rationale for why there is the rise of the right. The right, cashing on the resentments of people who have been long ignored. Their plight has been considered irrelevant. We are the elite. You do what we tell you. We will create the laws because we are superior. And after a while, people get tired of that rubbish. So, whether under one guise or another, stuff had to change. That it's changing in this way makes us all feel very uncomfortable because, there is something to be said that the old order was a lot of things, and a lot of things it was, but it was stable. And, people, even those who espouse revolutionary ideas on the right and on the left, people generally speaking are conservative in their approach. They don't like change. When they're confronted by change, they run a million miles per hour backwards when they say that when they see the tidal wave come toward them. So it's one thing to vote for someone in an election. It's an entirely different proposition when that person gets in and starts shaking up the joint, right?
Yeah, I mean, we could see a pendulum swing on this. There's some indication in the United States that there's a little bit of a pendulum swing. My experience with the United States is you get this the new president comes in, people are angry, they take to the streets, and then 3 months later they forgot and they're back
Yeah.
to watching Netflix and smoking pot and they're done. Um,
Yep.
I'm hoping that's not the case because you actually, I think, tapped into something that I think is really important. This could be the catalyst that creates a new system that is based on a better way, right? Trump might be the guy who helps us, and then the rise of the right in Europe helps us redefine the way we want to do things. So the United States has always had an immigration problem in the sense that we've always had this really powerful xenophobic thing. Like when German immigrants were first going to the United States in the 18th century, in the 1700s, Benjamin Franklin wrote this scathing piece talking about how they were lazy and they were going to steal your jobs. And that's been the mantra ever since. By the way, he then almost immediately afterwards opened a German language newspaper and began selling newspapers to the Germans because Ben
That's
Franklin was many
capitalism.
things,
Yeah, he
but
was a
he was a
capitalist.
capitalist. um, and so in a weird way, what we're experiencing today is the norm. It's not a departure from the norm, but there's an added component to this. So the U.S. is based on this idea that if you're a poor European, you can go to the United States, kill a few Native Americans, steal their farm because the Native Americans were already farming, steal their farm, take it over, and all of a sudden you own 40 acres of land. So all you needed to do was figure out how to get across the Atlantic. And then if you grow the right products and tobacco, maybe some cotton, and you gain enough wealth, you might be able to buy some slaves And so you got free land and free labor to build your wealth. And so, in a weird way, there's part of the US psychology is that I shouldn't have to work that hard and I should end up as a billionaire at some point. Like, I think the average American is a temporarily embarrassed billionaire. They're just waiting for that to happen that launches them into that wealth. But because of the labor movement in the United States, really serious inroads into a better quality of life for the average person were made. So that by 1973, the United States, it was by no means egalitarian, but that was the high watermark for the United States in terms of wealth distribution. So, one stat that I think helps frame it is the top 1% made 8% of the wealth in 1973.
Right.
Today, the top 1% makes 40% of the wealth, and then the next 15% make another 40. So the top 16% make 80% of all that's generated. And by the time you get down to the bottom 60%, I think it's 0.7% of the wealth that they're splitting. And so, the United States is a third world country because that's what you expect in third world countries. It's not first world. There's much more, there's a much better wealth distribution. It's just a really rich third world country. But it wasn't in 1973. In 1973, there was a much better wealth distribution. And the United States looked like it was becoming a more egalitarian state. It was down to like a 42-hour work week. There were lots of indicators we're moving in the right direction. But 73 is the year it turned around. And it started heading back the other direction. And now, in a way, 1973 is the moment we started heading back to the 19th century. And that was Nixon's goal. We elected a guy and whose mandate was to put the United States back to the way it was, to undo the civil rights movement, to undo this egalitarian path that we had been on. And he implemented a series of changes. Reagan came in and finished off most of those. And between Nixon and Reagan, we began to crush the middle class, shrink its wealth, and then eliminate a lot of the job opportunities that people had come to believe were coming their way, that they were sort of owed. And this hit the white population. And so the white population started looking for excuses and somebody to scapegoat. And there were all these brown and black immigrants coming in, and that became their target. So, in a really weird, twisted way, what the Republicans did was they created the situation to generate white resentment. And then they offered the solution, which was to be anti immigrant, when they're the ones who created the situation to begin with. And so the irony is we've elected Trump, a guy who's so racist. He announced his election plans on a golden escalator where he said Mexicans were rapists and murderers. Like that's the opening language he launched into because he knew he would tap into that white anti-immigrant sentiment, and he knew that there was this population of white people who would jump on board, and he played them. And he'll just continue the project. By the time he's done, the average person in the U.S. will be like a peasant. That's the goal of the right. And the fact that the average person doesn't understand the right shows that they haven't been paying attention to their history classes.
Oh, look,
So
I agree with you on that. But Roy, there is one very simple question that I have to put to you on this. Look, if what you're saying is true, and I don't doubt it, why was it so difficult for organized labor to push back in the United States? Because after having fought so hard during the 20s and 30s to get, the New Deal cemented this new architecture in the United States where there was that sort of almost equality of the various classes, and there was more of an egalitarian thing happening. Surely those people who fought so hard to gain this stuff would have a vested interest in keeping it. Why was it so easy for capital to steamroll through that and turn America into that spiteful, resentful country that it seems to be today, and with all the poverty that goes with it, right?
yeah, this is the conundrum, of course. So one of the pieces is the 1960s, and then another piece is the 1860s. So the United States does this civil war in the 1860s to get rid of slavery. The South never really surrendered. They gave up the idea that they were going to win militarily, But then what they did was they shifted their gears over to winning politically.
Yeah.
And so much of the United States' history over the last, 160 years has really just been, did I say 160? I meant 100. Wait, is it 160? Yeah, it's 160 years.
Yeah.
Over the last 160 years has been the South trying to figure out how it can reestablish the old order. Like it just has really been everything it can try to do to make it happen. Then came the 1960s, where there was this push to take the South even further out of that old order of, blacks were in a situation of subservience to the white population, and the result was that there was this pendulum swing amongst even average white voters who weren't necessarily even worried about the South because they weren't even Southerners. It was this moment where the 60s, with all its gains, maybe had pushed a little too far too quickly. Maybe if it had gone a little slower, it would have been easier to digest. And the Republican Party realized this. They figured it out. They actually figured it out in the 60s. In 1964, Barry Goldwater ran a campaign for president that appealed directly to Southern Democrats. And so here he is. He's a Republican appealing to Southern Democrats. And the shocking thing is he won 6 states. He won Arizona, his home state, and then he won Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina. And those states, those 5 states that I just mentioned, seceded from the Union 104 years earlier because a Republican had been elected president. And here it was, a Republican capturing those 5 states. And that was the moment where there was this schism then in the South, where Southerners started to go, why am I loyal to the Democratic Party? I need to think about the Republican Party. And they began to swing. The swing didn't go into full effect until the 80s and 90s. Reagan got up in the 80s and he said, there are 2 parties in the United States, a liberal party and a liberal party and a conservative party, and the Republican Party is the conservative party. And all of a sudden, all these conservative Democrats went, wait a minute, I'm in the wrong party. So that was part of what happened. Another thing that happened was the 60s was a perfect storm. The religious left, we don't, in the United States, we talk about the religious right. There, at the time, most evangelicals were left-leaning. And so it's a little weird to call them religious left, but they were. And what the reason was is they had read the New Testament and they thought that Jesus cared about the poor. And as a result, they believed it was their duty to care about the poor. And they got together with these socialists and liberals who were, in the streets protesting for civil rights, and the unions. And the 3 forces combined together. And that's what the civil rights movement was. It was students, liberal and socialist students who were in the streets. It was the religious left and unions working to try and dramatically and quickly flip the United States. And they made major strides, but that's one of the things that happened with Nixon's victory in 1968. That was the pendulum starting to swing back. And then, of course, by the time he got to Reagan, the pendulum had swung so much that a lot of those 1960s protesters had suddenly become Republicans. There was this argument whether Kamala Harris was X generation or a baby boomer. And, usually people put 65 as the baby boomer moment, and that would put her as a baby boomer. But that doesn't, the joke was, and I might have been the one posting this on Facebook, the joke was that she couldn't be a baby boomer because she wouldn't have been 18 in 1980 to vote for Reagan and then defy everything she had stood for when she was in the streets in the 60s protesting.
Right.
And so she has to be X generation by default then. And so that was part of it. Another thing that happened was we began charging tuition for public schools. So obviously tuition was for private schools, for private universities. I don't mean primary and secondary schools, but for universities. By charging tuition in universities for public schools, which is redundant, if it's already taxpayer based, then why are you charging? Anyway, by doing this, it took the students out of the equation because they had to have a job now to pay for tuition. They had to have a job now to pay for their dorm, and they had to pay for books. And so it made it so that the student population could no longer really be an effective protesting force. And then the Republicans they went to the religious left and they said, "What's worse, abortion or people starving to death?" And they went, "Yeah, abortion." And Republicans said, "Vote for us, and we'll get rid of abortion. Don't worry about people starving to death." And so the United States went lurching to the right, and in the process, a bunch of people in unions literally just gave up their union membership and bought the sort of the Reagan trickle down Reaganomics, which doesn't work, but they bought it and they bought into it. And if you survey the average uh, Republican in the United States, you'll find that they're slightly left leaning. Like if you sit there and go, "How are you on abortion? Where are you on gay rights?" You'll find that they're actually
Yeah.
slightly liberal. So a lot of what they've done is they identify as Republican as opposed to they believe in the Republican cause.
Right.
And in that way, the Republican Party has done a brilliant job of selling itself, and the Democratic Party has really dropped the ball. The Democratic Party is politically an incompetent party. It needs to fire everybody and start over at some level. Like it just, I have friends who are Democrats who are in government. They'll be so mad if they hear this, but they know it's true.
Yeah.
they,
Yeah.
it's a disaster of a party.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
How can
Okay.
it
Well,
not be winning? Like it doesn't even make sense. They
well,
have
see,
everything they need to win.
I don't understand one thing about the American polity, and that is after Trump's win, okay, we can make an excuse for the Democrats. They had their defeat, they were humiliated. Harris left the stage. The Democrats are effectively rudderless. But where is the leadership in the DNC that could step forward and say, look, we are now going to restructure and we're going to hit the ground running. Yes, we had our defeat, but let's suck it up. Let's suck up our resentment and our anger, and let's put it into some more positive venture to show that democracy is still viable in the United States. I don't see this, and it is
Yeah.
frightening the crap out of me because really what it says is that it wasn't Trump's win that was decisive and will change the world. It was the loss of the Democrats and the loss of what made them attractive. And I suppose one of the things that made them attractive was the idea that at some point they did give, I don't want to say shit, but I will. I mean, they did give a shit about the poor, and they were a little responsive when, they were early on in their development. And then that all disappeared, and they just looked like part of the elite. And when you buy
Yeah.
into the elite, that's it. If you happen to be Joe Sixpack, who can barely afford his six pack of beer, he's looking at all parties and looking at all leaderships across the board and saying a pox on all your bloody houses. I don't care. And the
Yeah.
crazy guy wins. He's got my vote. At least he looks animated. At least he looks orange. At least he provides a little bit of fun at a political rally. I can laugh at a few of his sayings. He's not so bad. It'll all be all right. It's not going to be all right. But the fact is that the Democrats have a huge responsibility for what has happened since the last election. And the fact that they had volunteered themselves away from politics for God knows how long. What are they going to come back for the midterms? I mean, by the time they organize themselves into a proper working opposition, Trump would have already done so much damage, not only to the United States, but the rest of the world. It's too late to do too much of anything. You can't roll that stuff
I
back,
agree.
right? So yeah, well, anyway, look, let's go from one disaster to another. So from the interior of the United States, we have to go to the next holy crap moment, which is likely to come from the Middle East in the next few hours after recording this podcast episode. I mean, after Trump's announcement of the US taking over Gaza, encouraging local Gazans to flee to Egypt and Jordan, and turning this bombed out territory into the Riviera of the Middle East, a deal was struck between Israel and Hamas on the release of Israeli hostages. Trump has said that if all the Israeli hostages were not released by Saturday noon, and just for the listening audience, we are currently recording on Saturday the 15th of February at 6:35 p.m. So I come to you from the future, but when you get this podcast, I'll be in the past. What's going to happen is that, bombs are likely to start falling all over Gaza again. So what if this were to happen, Roy? What do you think the likely response will be from the Arab states, who felt rather uncomfortable with a lot of the the verbiage coming out of Trump with regard to Gaza. What do you think the Arab states are going to do?
So this is a really interesting moment because, you know, at some level, the Arab states had sort of written off any meaningful solution for the Palestinian problem, which is that there's a displaced population that the world had written off, to the point where the United Nations has UNRWA, which is basically just an agency to deal with a permanent Palestinian refugee problem for all eternity.
Right.
And so I think at some level, Egypt, Saudi, the big players in the Middle East, with the exception of Iran, and maybe to a degree Syria, had just gone, all right, we're the Palestinians are stuck. They're going to have to make the best of being basically stuck in concentration camps. We call them refugee camps, but it's a nice euphemism. The Gaza Strip is basically a giant open air concentration camp. They're going to be stuck in this situation with a horrible economic situation, no rights, no passport, just non-humans basically, and we're just going to have to make the best of it. And so, at some level, the surrender was so complete that not only did Egypt make a deal and Jordan make a deal, but we had the Abraham Accords. Now, the goal of Egypt, Jordan, and the states that did the Abraham Accords, like UAE and Morocco, was if we can get the Israelis to calm down and push through their past trauma that was caused by Europeans, not us, we will at some point hopefully be able to integrate economically and culturally enough with our Jewish sisters and brothers, and they'll finally realize that what they're doing to the Palestinians is wrong. And because they'll feel safe, maybe there'll be a solution for the Palestinians in 50 or 100 years. Like the, the, the hope was that there'd be this long game, gentle diplomacy, integration, you know, encourage Israelis to fly to UAE and encourage Israelis to swim on the beaches in Egypt and just try to get them to normalize enough that they were calm.
Yep.
In the midst of all of that, we got this catastrophic genocidal event where the Israelis just murdered tens of thousands of Palestinians in a very short period of time to get vengeance for what happened on October 7th. And the fact that it became clear that it was no longer just about October 7th, that this was probably a land grab, and it was definitely vengeance on a scale that was completely unnecessary. This wasn't about destroying Hamas. This was about massacring the Palestinian population. It was a giant wake up call for the Arab world, because the Arab world could realize it could no longer play the long game, that there had to be something much quicker, a much quicker solution. Trump coming in and saying he's going to annex the Gaza Strip, eject the population, bulldoze the rubble, and rebuild like a Riviera on the Mediterranean has sent Arab leaders into a spiral. They don't know what they're supposed to do with this. Right there, how do you even negotiate? Where does it start? There's no middle ground on this. And I think what it's done is it's done to the Middle East and the Arab world in particular, but also Turkey, throw Turkey into the mix, what Trump has done to NATO. They've realized that the United States is no longer a reasonable or reliable ally, and that the president of the United States doesn't understand anything. Like, he keeps saying they keep getting knifed in Gaza, like knifed. I What happens in his tiny little walnut-sized brain that he thinks people are being knifed in Gaza? Like, where knifed? What does he think? And he makes it sound like it's just happening, like it's this random event. Like maybe there's a cloud of knives that fall on them. It's an act of God. We don't know where the knives are coming from, and like those are weapons that we gave Israel. They're not knives, and so the whole formula has sent Sisi into a spiral, MBS is in a spiral. UAE, where I live, the leadership has been trying really delicately to sort of walk this path, because UAE's goal is to be neutral, open for everybody, right? The goal is bring everybody on board. Let's make peace through trade. Let's make peace
Yeah.
through cultural exchange. Let's make peace through dialogue. And they're befuddled because they don't know how they can have dialogue with this conversation that's happening.
Mm.
You've made a mistake when you've alienated the UAE,
I agree with
because
that.
it's so hard to do.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, well, I would
And
hate to say that the UAE is like the Canada of the Middle East, but in many ways they are really lovely people, and you don't want to mess
yeah,
around with them because if you screw around with your relationship with really nice people in a maelstrom of rubbish, which is generally the region of the Middle East, you're asking for trouble, right?
yeah, especially because what the UAE has done is the UAE is in many ways has become the model for what you want to be if you're a Middle Eastern state.
Yeah.
Saudi Arabia is desperately trying to catch up, right? And
Mm-hmm.
and Egypt is on board. They're excited. They're trying to figure out how to do it without any money. So there's this moment that we could have had as a world where maybe we could have gone down a path and if the United States had just sort of woken up a little bit from its anti-Arab and anti-Muslim hatred, that we could have ended up making a deal with the Israelis at some point and softening the Middle East a little bit and made it a little bit easier for the Palestinians.
Yep.
But the result is that Trump is saying the most absurd, insane thing imaginable at this point. Like he's going to eject the Palestinian population. How is this not a crime against humanity? Like what does that even mean?
Yep.
I can't even wrap my mind around it. It just shows how little he understands about how the world works.
But it's not only that,
Um,
Roy, it's also who's going to be doing the ejecting. So Trump has said, all right, we're going to own Gaza. Oh, are you going to put boots on the ground? No, we're not going to put boots on the ground. Okay, so who's going to be doing the ejecting? Oh, well, there's a black hole here, right? So what are they going to do? Is the American State Department going to hire private military companies to do it? Are they going to, put American shoulder flashes on Israeli soldiers so they could do it on behalf of America? I mean, I don't know how this is going to go ahead. It seems like he had a brain fart one day, he let it all out, and everyone's having to sort of clean up the mess the best way they can. Although, although, and this is where the countervailing aspect comes in, and that is it's so crazy. It's the whole madman theory of international relations that Trump subscribes to. That perhaps now that the Saudis are scrambling to find an alternative solution to Trump's plan, isn't this exactly what Trump wanted? Local ownership of local problems. I mean, his plan is crazy. It doesn't bear any semblance to a policy that you could put forward in the real world, but it is making local people scratch their heads to figure out the solution. And maybe Trump will then say, well, you got the solution, there's Gaza, go for it. I mean, it could be that crazy. I don't know. Maybe I'm barking up the wrong tree.
I mean, I hope that it's that crazy and that's the goal, right? Wouldn't that be
Yeah,
great if this guy is
yeah,
just actually a genius and he's
yeah.
figured out a way to solve problems? Um, for the record, before 1967, there was local control. The West Bank was officially annexed to Jordan. My mother brought
Mm,
a souvenir back and it says Jerusalem, Jordan. I still have it because I was like,
mm.
oh,
Yeah, yeah,
what
yeah,
is this?
yeah.
And Gaza was under Egyptian administration. The Israelis don't want there to be a solution for this because
Mm,
they at the end of the day they want the whole thing, and the way to get the whole thing is to ethnically cleanse it. I think they want Trump to come in. I don't think
mm,
they want the Saudis to come in.
mm, mm,
And so even if this is Trump's goal, I have a sneaky suspicion the Israelis won't play the game. They're not interested. At the end of the day, I don't even know how you would do it if you. Well, it's funny. He also says it won't cost American taxpayers anything. Well, who's going to build the buildings? Like, are you going to? I have an idea. Let's enslave the Palestinians and make them do it for free.
mm.
Um,
Elon Musk's robot force will do it for free.
that's it, and it'll be
Yeah,
built with AI.
yeah, it will
AI
be.
will do it with the
Yeah,
robots. It'll be
yeah.
amazing, incredible, the most amazing thing you've ever seen. So, what would it look like? Saudi and Egypt and UAE and maybe several other partners trying to administer the Gaza Strip. What does that even mean? Why not do at that point? Why not just do the two-state solution and have a Palestinian state and let the Palestinians administer it?
Mm.
Two-state solution, of course, is what South Africa tried to do with its Bantustans, where it
That's
created
right.
Bophuthatswana and Transkei and Venda and Ciskei.
Mm.
So if that wasn't okay, then why is the two-state solution okay? I
Mm.
really think, at some point, if we're going to really fix this, there has to be a one-state solution with a secular democracy that guarantees rights for everybody who's living there. That seems so far into the future.
Mm.
But I have hope. Like I think that is the path. It's just somehow we have to get over this current drama and hump and get back onto that
Well, I'm not
path.
so sure, Roy, whether or not that's going to be so simple because uh, it seems, now I don't know 100%, but it seems that the Egyptians have mobilized a part of their army and sent it off to Sinai. There have been some reports
Yes.
coming out of the Jewish newspapers, Haaretz in particular, that people in Israel are starting to get worried because this is the first time since 1973 that the Egyptians are actually mobilizing large elements of their armed forces. Now, I don't think that a war is likely yet, but consider this scenario. Say in the next few hours, Hamas says, no, bugger it, we're not going to hand over any more hostages. You're going to have to do something more for us before we do anything. Netanyahu says, okay, well, we'll unleash hell. They unleash hell to such a degree that the Palestinian population cannot be contained by the borders. The Egyptians use their military to rush toward the border, trying to restore order and to prevent the Palestinians from flooding into Sinai. Then the Egyptians start shooting the Palestinians. I mean, this is going to be terrible for Egyptian PR. El Sisi will look like a monster, which will be exactly what Netanyahu wants, because then he can point the finger at El Sisi and say, see, he's an Arab, he's not taking the Palestinians, why should we? And so you've got the Palestinian stateless people moving around being shot at by both the Israeli and the Egyptian sides. You know, the only one that's going to win out of all this, sadly, will be Netanyahu. I mean, he really is the grand villain of the piece in many ways, and his weird Knesset alliances of right-wing religious Israelis who believe in the end of the world, literally. I'm not so
Yes.
sure whether that's a good bet, but we have to deal with the cards that we've been given, I think, Roy, don't we?
Yeah. And for the record, there's a bunch of U.S. evangelical Christians who believe this too and think that there's
Yeah,
going to be a war in the Middle East to
yeah.
trigger Jesus coming back, which
Armageddon.
I find fascinating.
Yep, yep.
Yeah. So um, your Sisi is in a really bad spot. There's no two ways about it because obviously he doesn't want to be in a position where he's shooting Palestinian refugees pouring into Egypt. Um, at the same time, he doesn't. He knows that if he doesn't act in a way that supports the Palestinian people, he could be facing another revolution. It's worth pointing out Egypt had a revolution in 1880, 1919, 1952, 2011, and then there
Yeah,
was the start of another one in 2013. That's five revolutions in a very short period of time.
mm,
Egyptian leaders over the last 145 years have learned they need to make the Egyptian population at least somewhat happy or they go down in a ball of flames. And
yeah,
considering the economic problems Egypt's been having, the last thing he needs is to look like he's collaborating with the Israelis and
mm,
not taking care of the Palestinian problem. So for him, I think his move into the Sinai is a threat.
mm,
It's not just we will block the Palestinians from entering the Sinai. We now are wondering if Camp David is on the table anymore.
yeah,
And that would be catastrophic for Israel if all of a sudden Egypt was back into a hostile position with Israel. Israel's economy took a hit, and a huge portion, not a huge portion in the sense of like it was catastrophic, but I think the number is about 500,000 Israelis have left Israel. When you consider
mm,
that there's 6 or 7 million Jewish Israelis, right? There's like 2 million Palestinian Israelis. That's a significant portion of the population. And then throw in the fact that Israel doesn't have an economy that can support the kind of action it did in Gaza. It only was able to do it because of European and US support. I think Israel is taxed. Its soldiers are tired. There isn't really the kind of uh, capacity that they had like 2 years ago to continue the genocide. So I think at
yeah,
some level, Israel does have to start looking at negotiating. Um, what just popped up on my screen as I was talking was that
From
three
CNN.
Israeli hostages were just released.
I was about to say that because it popped up on my screen as well, and I was going to say, well, maybe we're doom porning it too much, but
Yeah.
it
Well,
seems
how
that
many were supposed to be released? Was it just three?
I don't know. I
I don't
have to
know.
say,
So
yeah. Look,
that'll
I'll be
be
honest with
interesting
you,
to
I got
find out.
no idea. But look, it's good that they've been handed over. But is that enough? Was that the final tally, or will hell still be rained down on the Palestinians? I mean, yeah, God, who
You know,
knows?
Trump is a guy who threatens a lot and doesn't follow through with his threats,
Yeah.
or he does hollow threats. Like for example, he was barely in office when he bombed Syria in 2017. Well, before he bombed Syria, he told the Russians, "I'm going to bomb Syria. Here's the location I'm bombing." So not
Mm,
only did the Russians evacuate the airfield, they told the Syrians there to evacuate the airfield, and the dirt runway. So he just put potholes in a dirt runway. Like it was bluster, but there was no the United States lost millions of dollars worth of bombs,
mm,
causing tens of dollars worth of damage.
mm,
So he has a history of not doing the thing that he says he's going to do, which by the way I totally approve of, because uh, I'm against triggering another war or triggering a World War III by accident. So if my thinking is he's not gonna follow through. He's gonna switch conversations. He'll forget that Gaza even exists if the Palestinians don't release the hostages. If I were Egyptian and Saudi leadership right now, I would assume he's bluffing on taking over Gaza and he's not going to even try. That
mm.
this is just an attempt to get some kind of concession, but I don't know what the concession would even be.
Yeah.
And if I'm wrong, I'm happy to eat crow about this, but I do think this is all just a giant bluff at some level, in part because I don't think he's thought it through. I don't.
Mm,
What what is the United States going to do? He says he's not going to put boots on the ground. That's the only way to do what he wants to do. And
mm.
also, Hamas is an experienced fighting force that will continue to do guerrilla tactics against him. So the United States will get itself in another war it can't win.
Mm.
Um,
How
it
many would
couldn't
that
win in
rack up then?
Afghanistan.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like, how many wars do we have to lose? Why are we doing this? Why can't we just? I have an idea. Why don't we attack Germany? We've won twice against Germany, and they'll give us a good fight. As a person who's part German, I
Uh,
want to throw that out there as an option.
as a person of part Austrian descent, I would say, well, maybe not this time round. Maybe in 1939, but not now, because of what we were saying about Germany earlier and how it's been completely neutered. So if America wants to pick a fight with Germany, good luck. They'll have it. They'll have it for sure. Look, I'm John Bruni, and you're listening to Sage International's The Focus podcast from Dubai in the UAE. We're speaking with Professor of Government at Austin Community College, Texas, Roy Casagranda. Roy, many people found it strange, this Elon Musk's son, and Donald Trump being in the same room together, making public pronouncements that have some heft within the United States. I mean, Elon Musk is basically Donald Trump's prime minister for all intents and purposes. He
Yeah.
he smacked down those overpaid, incompetent bureaucrats because they're unelected officials, and yet he is himself an unelected official anointed by the Orange One. So what I'm wanting to find out is what is the deal with Elon Musk? How did we get to a point where this guy has really got his hands all over the instrumentalities of government? He's sending him his teenage hit force into various government agencies to lock bureaucrats out. I mean, obviously, as you were saying with the whole asteroid analogy, you start picking at certain things, it may be okay. But when you grab a little bit too much and then there's that deep, deep instability, the whole system caves in. And the irony of that statement is that many of the people who will be affected by Musk's uh, great reforms are going to be the MAGA base because they're lower middle class, struggling to make ends meet in the bureaucracy, happy to have a job, and all of a sudden the job gets taken away because of efficiency measures that Musk puts in. And I don't see universal basic income coming in from Musk to save the day, because at least if he had universal basic income as a properly pegged strategy that he can roll that out, people can then still, pay their mortgages, educate their children, and do stuff. But that's not on the table. He's just taking stuff out of the equation and letting the government scramble around to find out what's happened. Effectively, what he's done is he's taken the US government, thrown it up in the air, whatever lands, maybe we can use, or maybe we don't. I mean, that is a dangerous situation to be in, yeah?
Oh, totally. For one thing, we're going to lose a lot of talent.
Yeah, yep.
I'll give you just a small example of that. You know, you have to show up to work now, and
Yeah.
you can't do virtual. Well, a bunch of the government's talent is in California or Washington State or Illinois. And the reason why they had that talent was they had offered those guys virtual work. So you'll lose that talent because those people aren't going to want to move to Washington, D.C.
Mm.
Um, so that's on the table. They're thinking they're going to find a bunch of graft and corruption. I have no doubt that they're going to find spaces in which the United States government wasn't efficient. The United States government, like every state, has to constantly do this, finding where the corruption is, finding where the inefficiency is or the incompetence is, and try to clean it up.
Mm.
This idea that there's this deep state, there's just the state. I don't know why it needs to be deep. It's already there. It's the state.
Yeah,
The
yeah,
idea that
good
there's
point.
this deep state that's corrupt and it's inefficient. Yeah, $400 hammers. The Department of Defense is famous for having these money situations where the money isn't accountable, right? They don't know where it went. And then they had to go buy a $400 hammer. They actually only paid $10 for it. They just put $390 on there so that they could balance the ledger.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
but that's not. They did say that they're going to go after the DoD. I bet they don't because
Mm.
that's a part of their base. But you know, you're not going to find that by deleting the Department of Education. Deleting the Department of Education just deletes you're not going to get rid of its inefficiency. You're just getting rid of it. You're throwing the baby out
Mm.
with the bathwater.
Mm.
Um, it might be that we should break things up and shake things up, but you would want to do it slowly, one bureaucracy at a time. Figure out where the fat is, cut it out. Uh, Both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party are responsible for any fat that's there. So
Mm.
there's work that could be done. I'm not saying there isn't. Just this isn't the way to do it.
Yeah, yeah.
This is madness. In part because who's going to fill the gap that the Department of Education was filling? If you shut down the VA, who's going to take care of the veterans? Like you said, the people who were most benefited from this are the guys who voted for Trump. This is one of the conundrums too. If you look at the bottom 50% of the US population by wealth, they had an actual real income increase in the 4 years of the Biden administration of 7%. So after you take all the inflation out, they landed with a 7% increase in real wages. Now, the poorer you go, the better that is, because in the United States, the official minimum wage is $7.25, but the effective minimum wage is about $15. It is very
Wow.
difficult to hire somebody for less. So literally, in 4 years, the lowest of the low, the poorest of the poor had their income doubled. It's not
Mm.
7% for them. They voted 50% for Trump, 48% for Kamala. So the people who got a 7% pay raise supported Trump. And the number one reason they said they were supporting Trump was they were worried about the economy. So the people who benefited voted for the other guy and said the reason they were voting for the other guy is they were worried about the thing they benefited from. The top 50% had no meaningful change in their income. So that it was flat. So they
Mm.
could be, maybe they're grouchy because they wanted to see an income increase, but any income increase they had was offset by inflation. They were 50-50. So
Mm.
the richest Americans didn't get any benefit from the Biden administration in terms of income were just as likely to vote for Kamala as they were for Trump. The poorest Americans, the ones who are going to be most affected by what Trump does in a negative way, were the
Mm.
ones who voted for him, despite the fact that they actually got a actual benefit during the Biden administration. And one of the problems that that I think we're also facing in all of this is that the Democratic Party is just so bad at communicating with the public.
Oh,
It
yes.
doesn't know how to explain these things to the public. And the Republican Party has been getting away with this for decades. I mean, the nonsense of trickle down economics and
Mm.
Reaganomics, we're going to cut taxes for the rich and it's going to benefit the economy. It stalls the economy out because
Yeah.
that money that you were taxing the rich with was going back into the economy instead of the rich hoarding it and effectively taking the money out of the economy. And just the fact that we're there makes it really interesting that we're attacking the Department of Education, because if you have an educated population, they're not going to keep voting in ways that harm themselves. They're going to start to vote in a more meaningful way. In Texas, Governor Abbott for years has been trying to create a voucher system where instead of the public schools getting your property tax, in Texas, the public schools are funded by property tax.
Mm.
So if you live in a rich neighborhood, you have a nice public school because it has plenty of money. If you're in a poor neighborhood, you have a crap public school because there's no money.
Mm.
Um, what Abbott wants to do is take all that money out and then hand it to the parents, and then the parents will decide if they're going to spend the money on a private school or a public school. He hasn't been able to pull this off because the largest employer in the rural counties in Texas are the public schools. And if you do this, you're pulling that money out of public schools. You will cripple those public schools. You will cripple the economies of those districts. So the irony has been in the Texas state legislature that the conservative Republicans will side with the liberal Democrats to block this year after year. Right now they're in session. It is very likely they're going to get this thing through.
Mm.
And part of the reason is because Abbott went after all the Republicans that stood up to him last time. And as a result, we could see this happen in Texas, and it's very likely it'll hurt the rural Texas economy. And then, of course, those voters will blame Democrats for
Yeah.
having had their economy hurt. And the Democrats will be befuddled. They won't know how to explain, no, the Republicans did this to you. And then they'll have drooling idiot moron children who can't read, and they won't
Yeah.
know why, and they can't go to college. But of course, that's another thing that's happened. In the United States, Republicans are starting to go to college less and less. And so we're seeing this ideological divide on education, which is alarming and frightening because why, first? And then second, like you're hurting yourself economically in the long term for an ideological reason. It's hard to comprehend. I'm saying all this because I think that's why they're going after things like the Department of Education. Their goal is to reduce the population into a more subservient, easier to manipulate population. So it's not
I,
just that they want to
yeah.
tackle corruption, they
Yeah.
have another agenda that's behind this.
Well, I was going to say, as a parent of two young kids going to school, and from an older generation, I'm not a boomer, I'm the one after. What are the X's? What are they? X's.
We're X, yeah.
X. We're X. Okay, so,
Congratulations, by the
well,
way.
thank you. I just slipped over the line there. Anyway, 1966, it was an excellent year. But I have to say, the way that I was educated was very different from the way the kids are educated today. Today, the school gives them an iPad or a computer. And
Yeah.
kids, it doesn't matter how strictly you police, unless you're a Nazi on the home front, who wants that stress? The kids will work around you, they will go onto their games, they will do things that will amuse them, but they won't be having that curiosity to find out, well, gee, I wonder what dad's doing in the office talking to that guy in Dubai. They won't have that natural sense of curiosity to go out and find out. And I'm seeing that not just in my kids, but I'm seeing that in this generation of children that are now being sold on the idea that technology is going to be the solver of all their problems. Their homework can be done by ChatGTP, and if it isn't done officially, then unofficially people keep on putting their homework through ChatGTP. There's a permissiveness in this AI world that we're living in, which is corrupting what education was meant to be about. And there have been many scientific studies coming out of the United States, of all places, suggesting that cursive handwriting is one of the greatest gifts you can give your child because it really fires up the synapses and keeps the brain growth going, especially when they're in their early teenage years. That would be something that we ought to be focusing on at schools rather than handing out iPads and Lenovo Yoga Flex pads. and all that kind of stuff. Because really, it's only making money for the tech bros, but it's not doing anything for the kids. The kids are using these tools not as tools, but actually as toys. And this is something that we have to recognize, and no one's recognizing it, not in the US, not in Australia, pretty much nowhere else in the West that I'm aware of. I think that people are uneasy about all of this, but they don't know how to articulate it, and they don't know that going back a step is probably a good thing for all of us. I'll get off my soapbox now.
I, I'm having to go back a step because I what I started doing at some point was I decided I wanted to take a little bit of the stress out of the classroom and stop doing in-class tests.
Yeah,
And they have more time for lecture and discussion, and then they would write an essay, and then that was great for them too, because then instead of doing a multiple choice test that's in class, they're doing an essay, and that makes them think more. I can't do that anymore because they're just going to run it through ChatGPT, and ChatGPT is going to write their essay.
yeah,
So my plan going forward is that I'm going to have them in the classroom, pencil and paper, writing their
yeah,
test out.
yeah,
And so I am going back because I don't know how else to do this.
yeah.
Um, I think we have this sort of foolish default setting that technology always improves things.
Mm,
And one of the things that I think some people have started to realize is, social media ain't as great as we thought it was going to be.
correct.
And maybe that type of communication isn't as productive as we had hoped to. Like I think in the beginning, 25 years ago, I was thinking, you know, we would have real discussions and we could maybe even link up with each other around the world and have these discussions. And what we discovered instead was people behave like sixth graders and they shout and scream at each other, and
Oh,
there's no
yes.
changing anybody's opinion. And so it just turned into this really angry space instead of this space where there was a real exchange of ideas. So for me, I'm a little bit of a techno skeptic. I was just at the World Government Summit this week
Ah,
in Dubai.
right.
Um, and one of the things that I was doing was sort of checking to see where people were with things.
Yeah.
And so, especially with the US delegation that was there, because there was, hanging out with my, my, my brothers and sisters trying to figure out exactly where they were landing in all of this.
Hmm.
And there was a population of us who moved to Dubai, which was really interesting. I was
Yeah.
a little bit. Ray Dalio now has a house here in Dubai. He's one of
Oh,
those
does he?
guys.
Oh, wow.
Um, yeah, and
Mm,
and when I would ask the population of people why they came, it was we didn't want to do another Trump term.
mm,
Ray Dalio thinks the United States has about 3 years left before it starts to unravel. So he's
mm.
just trying to not retire in that mess.
Yeah.
It'll be interesting in 3 years. We 2028. We need to check back in and see how Ray
Yeah.
Dalio's prediction came through. By the way, he made this publicly. This wasn't with me, so I don't think I'm saying
Right.
anything that he would be mad about being quoted over.
Right.
Um, One of the things that I found really fascinating was, and I'm making this number up because I didn't keep careful track, about three quarters, about 75% of the people, the Americans were not just pro AI, they were pro Trump.
Mm, mm.
And it seemed to correlate really strongly.
Yes.
The journalists, the researchers, the professors were almost universally, there were some exceptions, freaked out by Trump and
Mm,
worried about AI. The tech bros, the CEOs were
mm,
almost without exception pro Trump and really gung ho about AI. One of the speakers said, in 3 years, there will be human beings will serve no purpose. AI will have completely replaced us in every aspect, to the point where you won't even have to think. You won't be creating anymore. AI will do all the creation. And then, his he said the solution is start using AI as much as you can now, and of course, so that I can be filthy rich, so that I can go
mm,
into this
mm.
period of meaninglessness with nothing. It's interesting that 3 years in both cases. So in 2028, we have to check back in to see if that's true too. And the thought that popped into my head was, wait, I will serve no purpose? You just took away meaning. Like,
Mm,
what's the point in living? To watch
mm,
Netflix all day?
mm.
Like, don't get me wrong, I like Netflix. It's just,
Yeah.
I, well, what's the purpose in life? how are we going to get meaning out of our lives if we serve no purpose because AI has taken over everything? And I think there's this kind of bizarre uh, view that's coming out of the leadership in the United States about what AI is going to do for us. And here's another way to think about it, I think. If we were really talking about AI being a liberating force, then why aren't we talking about a 10-hour work week? Why
Well, that's
isn't there
right.
conversation? Why isn't there conversation about, Musk says we spend too much time in college. We need to shrink the number of years. First of all, I don't think that makes any sense. I don't think we spend enough time in college. But if AI is going to be such a liberating force and as a result, we won't need people to work as much,
Mhm.
why don't we make better citizens? Why don't we add a year to high school and make it so that by the time you have a high school diploma, you know more about the world? Why don't we add 2 years to a bachelor's degree? If all of a sudden all this labor demand will be released, this would be a way to spend that labor by creating better citizens, more intelligent citizens. And the answer is they
You
don't
don't want
want
them.
the liberal arts
That's
education
right.
because the liberal arts education turns you into a critical thinker. And a
Yeah.
critical thinker isn't going to be duped.
Mhm.
So this
Correct.
is counterintuitive, but I think their plan with AI is they're just going to turn us into mindless consumers and leave us in a situation where we won't need an education because there's nothing to do because our lives are meaningless. And
You know,
that was shocking.
it was interesting. I was having a similar conversation with some friends of mine last Thursday morning, and I will say we're determining where we are going in the broader scheme of things. Is it more Orwell 1984 or Aldous Huxley's Brave New World? And I
Yeah.
always think it's more Aldous Huxley's Brave New World because we are buying into the luxury, we're buying into the social stratification of wealth, we're buying into all of this thing, we're volunteering our rights away. There's no compulsion, no one's really forcing us. And if we really wanted to take a stand, we could take a stand. No one bothers because why should I? It's too much hard work. I might get endangered. Who's going to sacrifice? I'm not going to sacrifice my life in order to have a better society. That's why we have politicians. And if the politicians are failing us, it'll all work out on the night, won't it? I mean, that's the sort of bloody-minded attitude that we have. So I do think that Aldous Huxley was absolutely spot on in terms of his Brave New World construct. And I think that at least in the Western side of the hemisphere, it'll be that. It may be Orwell on the Chinese and the Russian side or the North Korean side, but it's certainly going to be Huxley on our side of the world. So we're really looking at two competing dystopias rushing toward the bottom. And that I think is a very
I
frightening,
agree.
you know.
Yeah, I've always thought it was insane that there are components of both of those dystopias happening at the same time. But I
Right.
agree with you, Eileen Huxley.
Yeah,
Just because of this, we've embraced the stratification.
we
Like
have.
there's a sense of, well, I'm not smart enough to have been a brain surgeon. That guy should be making all that extra money. And
Yep.
I don't disagree with we should reward talent. It's
Mm.
just I think we're doing it at an obscene level. Uh, Especially when you consider entertainment and the amount of money that entertainment makes, it doesn't make any sense.
No, exactly.
One of the things I also found interesting is people who had previously been really critical of Trump have
Mm.
suddenly flown over and now they're in the Trump camp. And I
Yep.
think some of that is fear. They're worried that if they're not in with Trump, he's going to punish them and he's going to hurt them. You
Mm.
know, Bezos had been how critical of Trump, and now all of a sudden there he is at the inauguration, making it
Yep.
clear he's pulled over. And we're seeing that with artists as well, who have
Mm.
suddenly become Trumpkins.
Mm.
Um, the word in academia in the United States is if you're a professor, you need to shut up. You need to
Mm.
be a little bit more reserved in your criticism because since there's going to be an academic purge, and you don't want to be one of the purged professors, and
Yep.
and so I think in addition to the complacency or even the apathy by the public, there's also this, oh my God, I'm going to get axed. I need to be
Mm.
careful. I need to worry about my future. But for the record, I am one of those people
Mm.
that's worried about this future. I'm not saying that it's wrong to be scared. I definitely think people should be scared. Um, especially because he has this extortion attitude where, I'm going to come after you, and if you're
Mm,
his enemy, he hates you, and he will be relentless.
mm.
And the only thing I think that gives me like pause to have hope is how quickly he goes through people. Right
Yeah,
now, he's in a
yeah.
bromance with Musk, but how long will that last? Especially as people keep calling him President Musk,
Mm,
and
mm,
time keeps putting him behind the Oval Office desk. I
yeah.
think that'll push against Trump's narcissism, and it'll really freak him out at some point. And he'll turn on him, and then the real contest will be to see who wins in that.
Mm, mm.
That's one of the interesting things that I've always found about politics is people backstab each other on a regular basis. But it seems like the extreme far right, it's hyper backstabbing. Like there's this constant. It's not the normal. I'm just.
Yeah,
It feels like it's
yeah.
got an extra component to it.
It's always the night of the long knives in the right, right?
Yeah, I've been trying to figure out who the SA is in this scenario. And
Yeah,
my
yeah.
initial thinking was, is he going to go after like the Proud Boys or something? But I
Mm,
think he'll just roll the militias and the Proud Boys into the SS, the Secret
mm,
Service. He can just hire them. I do think it's ironic that Hitler's bodyguard was called the SS, and the US's bodyguard is the Secret Service, which spells out SS. Uh,
No
so
conspiracy theory here, though.
no, no, no. Uh, having said that, I think it's the tech pros. I think they're
Yeah,
on board now, and Trump's playing the game. And then at
yeah.
some point, when he thinks he's had what needed to get out of them, he'll turn on them.
Oh,
And
sure.
I think they're gonna be really upset and shocked. But
Mm.
they should have read some more history and maybe a few less technical manuals.
Yeah, see,
Um,
that it'll be the revenge on the nerds, not the revenge of the nerds in the end.
oh, it's too bad too, because I identify as a nerd. I want the nerds to win.
Not in this case, though, Roy. I'm sorry to say. Okay,
You should
final
be
two.
careful who you make as your friend. I think this
Uh,
is the.
I do think that that is absolutely true. Look, Roy, thank you very much for the time that you've put in so far. A final two questions, and I'll try to make them as quick as possible. So, President Trump has been true to his word about the use of tariffs as his greatest weapon. Why is he wielding them against long-term allies rather than against his strategic competitors? I mean, is every country now a hostile competitor?
This is something I can't wrap my mind around. Don't mess with your allies. Go
Yeah.
go to them gently and negotiate and say, "Hey, look, I need X." Odds are really good you'll get some kind of concession out of them, especially if you're the United States, because your allies want to make you happy.
Hmm.
The United States is the richest country on earth. It has a catastrophic debt that I can't wrap my mind around of $36 trillion. I think this year we're scheduled to pay over $1 trillion in interest payments alone. So just servicing the debt eats a big chunk of our GDP. Our debt is bigger than our GDP, right? But we're still the richest country on earth. Why do we need to turn the screws on anybody?
Hmm.
we sh- we're 4.5% of the population and 25% of the GDP. Like we should be being generous with everybody. And here's why. It's simple economics. If I'm a business person and I go to you and I make a deal that's good for me but bad for you, then next year when I come back to make a deal with you, you'll be in a weaker position and you may not have as much product to sell me because I gouged you so bad.
Yeah.
On the other hand, if I come and I make a deal that's good for you and good for me, then when I come back next year, you might have grown your business and I'll have somebody I can work with and I can, it'll make things better.
Hmm.
One of the problems with capitalism and this sort of hyper capitalism is it's so cutthroat and backstabbing that it tends towards monopolies. That's one of the reasons why Bill Gates turns out to be so smart. What does he do? He starts working with Steve Jobs, his competitor, because he understands that competition will actually benefit him, not hurt him.
Yeah.
And so both guys end up winning because they realize they need the competition. The UAE kind of has this mindset, right? And Dubai
Hmm.
competes with Abu Dhabi.
Yeah.
They don't hate each other. They're just competing. This is a rivalry. They're
Hmm.
friends. They really love each other. They name
Hmm.
streets after each other's rulers, and they
Hmm.
hang out together. And they're very cooperative, but they have an edge. There's
Yes.
nothing wrong with it. That's fantastic. Do that. What Trump does is he comes in threatening these insane tariffs, and and nobody even necessarily knows what he's after. He wants you to go back to negotiation tables. He already did that. He renamed NAFTA the USMCA
Yeah.
because he brought them back to renegotiate,
Yeah.
and he doesn't even remember that apparently.
Yeah.
One of the things he said is he wanted to do a 25% tariff on all cars imported from Mexico. 40% of the cars imported from Mexico are GMs and Fords. They're American cars, in American with air quotes, because the reality is that they're made in Canada, Mexico, the United States, with parts coming from the Philippines and Vietnam. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
they're 30-40% American. They're 60% NAFTA and 10% East Asia. Um, but it would devastate the auto industry in the United States if he actually did this thing. He would cripple the American auto industry. He might as well just hand China the keys at that point.
Yeah.
China's already gotten into the auto industry in a big way.
Yep.
And, like at a time when we need to be shoring up our relationship with Canada and Mexico, like maybe getting rid of the border between
Mm.
United States, Canada, and Mexico, at a time when we need to be integrating our economies, he's playing extortion games with them, and he's the ruler of the richest country on earth. Like, it just makes no sense. We should be shoring up our alliances, developing the global economy so that the United States benefits from that global economy, and we should be trying to develop the United States internally as well, and putting a little bit of effort into that. But that's not the agenda. The agenda of the extreme far right is to increase stratification, serve the extreme wealth, trick the lower class and the lower middle class into voting for them. And I don't get the foreign policy aspect because I don't know how it helps Elon Musk to have so much chaos in the world. 2 years ago, Musk was interviewed by Mohammed Al Dargawi at the World Government Summit.
Right. Right.
Musk was supposed to show up, but he didn't feel like it, so they did a virtual interview.
Mm.
And Musk said point blank, it's on their website, you can find his talk. He said, I don't like what you guys are doing. You're creating too much cooperation. What the world needs is less cooperation.
Well,
And
well, there
Muhammad
you
Al
go.
Gargawi goes, oh my God, that's fine 1,000 years ago when we were hacking each other to death with swords. But today we
Yeah.
have nukes. What are you talking about?
Yep. 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 My God.
and uh, And when I heard His Excellency's remarks, I was like, thank you for pushing back on this. Where is this coming? Where is this coming from even? And that's, I think, Trump and Musk's mindset is that somehow creating all this chaos is going to lead to something good. I just, I don't get me wrong. A little bit of chaos is definitely good. Competition is definitely good. This is weird. This is attacking your friends, and it's
Mm.
so transactional. It kills the ability of anybody to trust the United
That's
States
right.
going forward because they're
Yep.
just going to see this as all you want from us is our wealth. You don't care about making the world a better place.
Exactly. Well, okay, so final question. As an Australian, my greatest fear is that the new security compact AUKUS might well be scrapped after significant Australian taxpayers' funds have been committed to purchasing American submarines. Now, we have a political culture here that is highly deferential to the United States, whoever is in charge. Our ability to kiss the ring and bend the knee to Washington has kept us under the radar for some time. Do you think this will keep our relations with the United States on sound footing, or are we really in uncharted waters?
Yeah, since you brought up submarines, I'm going to go with uncharted waters. First of all,
Okay.
the tragedy of losing AUKUS is it's such a good name,
Yeah.
right? Just to
Yeah.
start, if you're
Yeah.
going to name something, I like the sound of AUKUS.
Yeah.
Uh, I wish I could tell you. So this is the thing that's so baffling about the position we're in the world. Who knows what's going to happen? If I were Australia, I would assume that AUKUS is done. Like that, if I were a policymaker in Australia, and I would be starting to look for another way to make this work.
Yeah. Yeah.
Australia's security, make it work. More conversations with Japan and South
Yeah.
Korea and Indonesia to
Absolutely.
start.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes.
I but maybe even untraditional uh, pathways like talk to Brazil, talk to
Mm,
South Africa, talk
mm,
to Egypt. Why not?
mm, mm.
Well, Egypt can't do much for Australia's defense, but at the end of the day, any conversation and any linkage is a good linkage.
Yeah.
And I think that's what the world needs to start thinking about going forward is maybe there was too much reliance on the United States, and maybe there was this assumption the United States would always be there as this superpower. If there's nothing else, history tells us is that every single empire eventually will implode.
Mm-mm.
And the number one reason is what happened inside the empire.
Yeah.
Empires are rarely destroyed from outside; they're almost always destroyed from within.
Mm.
And I think that's what we're seeing. We're seeing the United States in its dying, in its death throes, lashing out and trying desperately to try to figure out what to do. The tragedy is we know what to do. They should just tax the heck out of the rich, take that money to pay off that stupid debt and fix the infrastructure and start educating the public and
Yeah.
start working more cooperatively with the rest of the world. Um, in the case of Australia, I don't think Trump knows where it is or why it would be significant or how it has a strategic purpose. I mean,
Mm.
we do,
Mm.
but I don't think he does. And so I think he would be asking himself questions like, what is Australia giving us?
Yep.
And
Yep.
and to me, in an alliance system, you don't need to ask that question, right? That question shouldn't even, we are partners, we work together, we have interlinked economies, we have interlinked security interests. That's what you're getting out of the relationship.
Yeah.
We have cultural connections to each other. Maybe we don't even have cultural connections. We just like each other. That should be sufficient
Mm.
to create an alliance. The United States is a profoundly flawed electoral republic. Australia has a good electoral republic. At least you're both electoral republics. Like they have that in common. Australia
Well, apparently
has
that's not
functioning
enough.
elections.
Yep.
Yeah, apparently it's not enough. Red, white, and blue flags. I don't know,
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
something, because I feel like this is a foolish time for us to be creating more division with
Mm.
so many things going on the planet at the same time. Um, and it blows my mind. The fact that we've been losing democracies on the planet
Mm.
steadily for the last, it depends on what data you look at. 2009 is a pretty good year to use. I've seen 2014 as a year, but there's been sort of like a steady decline in the number of democracies on the planet. That should be putting all the electoral republics on alert on how we can stem the tide of that.
Yeah.
Because electoral republics tend to work together. They tend to work
Mm.
really well together. We've got new monarchies that are doing really exciting and amazing things. We should be looking towards the states that have that same view of innovation and trying to link with them. And
Great.
instead, we're doing transactionalism instead of relationship building.
Well, I'd like to be an optimist, and I'll end this podcast on an optimistic note. Maybe we have to go through the fire and hell of a Trump 4-year term before we get out and see the roses, and we can smell them as well. So let's just hope.
So that's actually what I just told a group of youth that I met with in here in UAE. They were Model United Nations. I said, look, this next 4 years is going to be hard.
Mm.
My hope is on the other side, we will be able to imagine a better world and that
Yeah.
we will set up the networks to start working together and thinking about how to create that new world, and
Mm.
that Trump will sort of push us to do it.
Yeah.
Maybe this is what we needed. Maybe we were too complacent, watching, too much entertainment and not paying attention to the world enough. I hope that's true.
Mm.
There's a part of me that does believe it, but there's a part of me that's like, well, I don't know. I think this ship just might sink.
Roy Casagranda, thank you very much for joining us again on our first episode for 2025 on The Focus.
Thank you so much for having me.
No worries. From Dubai, UAE, that was Dr. Roy Casagranda. Thank you for joining me, John Bruni, for today's episode with Roy Casagranda. Check out the links in our show notes to learn more about Roy and connect with him on social media. Now for questions for our audience. How do you think the second Trump presidency will impact US immigration policies? What are the likely impacts on the US economy and social cohesion? Given Trump's stance on NATO and transatlantic relations more broadly, do you believe his approach strengthens or weakens the Western alliance in the face of global threats? How should the US handle its involvement in the Russia-Ukraine war? Would a Trump-enforced ceasefire be a Ukrainian defeat or a Russian victory, or both? Can Trump's Middle Eastern plans for Gaza and the Palestinian people who have called this territory home succeed, or will it just bring about more misery and violence to the Middle East? Let us know in the comments section below. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's a free way to support us. You can also subscribe to the podcast on the Ozcast Network, iTunes, and Spotify, where we would appreciate your 5-star reviews. Do you have any comments or questions about the podcast? Post them in the comments section on YouTube, and I'll do my best to respond to as many as I can. My thanks as ever to the producers of the podcast, Malcolm Hughes and Neil Smart. Please stay connected with us on social media. Follow me on X at BruniDoctor, and follow The Focus on X at TheFocus_Sage. From Adelaide, South Australia, you've been listening to The Focus.
Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.